In the vast, terrifying calculus of World War II, the measure of success was often defined by the millimeter, the minute difference between a direct hit and a devastating miss. Nowhere was this precision more critical, and yet more elusive, than in the grim arithmetic of anti-aircraft defense. Against the fast, high-flying aircraft of the enemy, conventional artillery was a blunt instrument, its effectiveness relying on pure chance, overwhelming volume, or the vanishingly small probability of a direct physical strike. The standard anti-aircraft shell required a time fuse, a mechanism manually set by the gun crew to explode after a calculated number of seconds, ideally near the target's estimated position. This system was rife with error. Wind currents, changes in target speed, and the innate lag in human reaction times meant that gunners were essentially attempting to hit a rapidly moving target with a precisely timed invisible dart, a task of immense, frustrating difficulty. The vast majority of shells exploded harmlessly, showering the sky with expensive shrapnel, achieving only minimal deterrence. The sheer inefficiency of this system was a strategic liability. The amount of ammunition expended to achieve a single confirmed kill was staggering, diverting massive industrial resources away from offensive operations. This profound operational weakness begged for a radical technological answer, one that could remove the human and environmental variables from the equation. The solution, when it finally arrived, was not just an improvement. It was a revolution, a technological breakthrough so profound that it was ranked by Allied leaders alongside the atomic bomb as the most crucial non-atomic secret of the entire war. This secret weapon was the variable time fuse, or simply the VT fuse, a device that granted the anti-aircraft shell a form of electronic sight. It transformed the defensive capabilities of the Allied forces. Yet its existence was so delicate and its mechanism so vulnerable to capture that its use was severely restricted, creating a strategic paradox. A device designed to save lives was initially forbidden from being deployed where it was needed most. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of relying on a clock, the shell would explode when it sensed the mere proximity of its target. This removed the necessity of perfect aiming and perfect timing. The shell, having missed its target by tens of feet, would still detonate, showering the enemy aircraft with a lethal cone of shrapnel. This guaranteed an effective kill radius, multiplying the effectiveness of every shot fired. The implementation of this concept, however, required conquering monumental engineering obstacles that were, by the standards of the 1940s, almost unimaginable. The entire mechanism, a fully functional miniature radio transmitter and receiver, a firing circuit, and a self-contained battery, had to be compressed into a space smaller than a soda can and built robustly enough to survive the brutal forces of acceleration upon firing. The shell's initial acceleration subjected the internal components to forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity, a violent, crushing environment that shattered standard electronic equipment. The challenge was clear: create the world's smallest, hardest radio that could survive being shot from a cannon. The successful realization of the VT fuse demanded a technical triumph over the fundamental laws of physics and materials science. The project, codenamed Operation D and led by the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, was a frantic, multi-million-dollar race against time. The primary engineering hurdle was the miniaturization and ruggedization of the electronics. Standard vacuum tubes, the heart of any radio device, were fragile glass structures designed for static, room-temperature environments. Subjecting them to 20,000 Gs of acceleration meant they had to be completely reinvented. The solution involved designing specialized, miniature sub-miniature vacuum tubes that were built like tiny fortresses, using thicker glass, internal bracing, and clever mechanical mounting designed to withstand the sudden, immense forces of the cannon blast. The research required creating entirely new manufacturing processes. The engineers had to invent new methods of mounting the delicate tubes, embedding them in resilient plastic compounds, and suspending them to absorb the shock. This innovation in ruggedized miniaturization was, in itself, a revolution that would later find applications across post-war electronics. Equally critical was the power source. The fuse required a battery capable of remaining completely inert during storage, but which could be instantly activated upon firing, providing enough power to run the radio transmitter for the 15 to 20-second flight time of the shell. The solution developed was a revolutionary liquid electrolyte battery, which used the force of the shell's acceleration to instantly mix the electrolyte into the cell, activating the power source just as the shell left the muzzle. This piece of chemical engineering brilliance ensured that the fuse remained electrically dead and safe until the moment of firing. The operational concept of the fuse relied on the Doppler effect. The tiny radio transmitter inside the shell emitted a continuous electromagnetic wave. When the shell passed near a target, the radio wave reflected back. The reflection was slightly shifted in frequency due to the target's movement and the shell's own velocity, the Doppler shift. The receiver measured this shift. Critically, the fuse's circuitry was designed to measure not the target's distance, but its rate of change of distance. As the shell closed on the target, the strength and frequency shift of the reflected wave increased dramatically. When the calculation indicated the shell was within the optimal kill radius, typically 70 feet, the magnetic relay was triggered, detonating the main explosive charge. The entire process, transmission, reception, calculation, and detonation, occurred within milliseconds. The complexity of this analog computing system, built into a space no larger than a pint glass, was a testament to the concentrated power of wartime science. The successful implementation of the VT fuse meant that the anti-aircraft gun no longer had to hit the target. It only had to miss by a little. The triumph of engineering was immediately overshadowed by the urgent necessity of extreme secrecy. The VT fuse was correctly identified by Allied command as a strategic asset of such immense value that its mechanism could not, under any circumstances, fall into enemy hands. If the Germans or Japanese acquired even a single intact fuse, they could reverse engineer the technology, develop effective countermeasures, and, most terrifyingly, integrate the fuse into their own offensive weapons, transforming their artillery into instruments of unprecedented destructive power. The secrecy mandate was absolute. This led to the most critical operational restriction imposed upon the new weapon. The VT fuse was forbidden from being used over land where there was any risk that a dud shell, or one that exploded low over the battlefield, could be recovered by enemy ground troops. The rule was inviolable. The initial deployment of the VT fuse was therefore restricted exclusively to naval operations and anti-aircraft defenses at sea. The logic was grimly simple. Any shell that failed to detonate would plummet into the ocean, where the water pressure and depth would ensure its destruction and prevent enemy recovery. The first operational use began in January 1943 on U.S. Navy cruisers in the Pacific. The results were instantaneous and transformative. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners, previously plagued by the frustrating inefficiency of time-fused shells, saw their confirmed kill rates multiply overnight. A single salvo from a ship equipped with the VT fuse could now devastate an incoming Japanese bomber formation. The fuse dramatically increased the effective range and lethality of naval anti-aircraft guns, fundamentally changing the defensive capabilities of the fleet. The effectiveness of the VT fuse was so profound that Japanese pilots, facing the new invisible curtain of exploding shrapnel, reported that the Americans were using magic shells that required no direct hit. This psychological impact was immediate and measurable, adding a layer of terror and uncertainty to every enemy air attack. However, the success at sea only amplified the strategic paradox. While the Navy was utilizing this game-changing technology to defend its ships, the Allied troops fighting for air superiority in North Africa, Italy, and later Europe were still forced to rely on the antiquated, inefficient time fuse, all because of the fear of compromise. This political and operational conflict, the knowledge of a war-winning technology being deliberately withheld from the most desperate ground combat zones, created immense pressure within the Allied High Command. The question was not if the fuse should be deployed on land, but when the strategic necessity would outweigh the security risk. The decision would ultimately be forced by the arrival of a new, terrifying threat to the Allied home front. The operational successes of the VT fuse at sea were so significant that they triggered an intense internal conflict within the Allied High Command regarding the viability of its continued restriction. Commanders in the European and Mediterranean theaters, desperate to stem the rising tide of enemy air attacks, clamored for the new magic shell. They argued that the tactical advantage gained by immediate land deployment would far outweigh the speculative risk of the enemy recovering a dud fuse. The internal memos and dispatches from the front lines highlighted the devastating cost of continued reliance on the old time-fused artillery. However, the architects of the VT fuse program remained rigidly opposed to any breach of the security mandate. They understood that the technological gap was massive. If the Germans acquired the secret, they could rapidly replicate the device and deploy it against Allied bombers and ground targets, turning the strategic advantage back on the Allies. The weight of the initial decision rested heavily on President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who personally understood the technology's value and maintained a singular, unyielding stance on its security. Roosevelt decreed that the fuse could only be used on land if the tactical situation became so desperate that the failure to deploy it would result in a greater strategic catastrophe than its compromise. This became the standing order. The VT fuse would remain a secret naval weapon until the moment of ultimate strategic necessity. The defining moment of crisis arrived in June 1944, with the beginning of the German V-1 flying bomb campaign, the Buzz bombs, launched against London and other crucial British cities. The V-1 was a weapon of terror and strategic disruption, flying fast, low, and autonomously. Conventional anti-aircraft artillery proved largely ineffective against these fast-moving, small targets. The time-fused shells often exploded either too early or too late, failing to intercept the V-1s before they reached their urban targets. The German campaign inflicted massive casualties and severely hampered the logistical preparations for the ongoing D-Day invasion. London was suffering, and the strategic disruption was mounting. The situation had escalated into the precise catastrophic emergency Roosevelt had anticipated. The tactical need to defend the British home front, the single most critical Allied logistical hub, against the V-1s, finally outweighed the risk of technological compromise. The deployment of the VT fuse over land was authorized, but the deployment remained highly restricted and managed under the tightest security protocols, marking the end of the Navy's exclusive access to the weapon. The authorization to deploy the VT fuse over land was implemented with lightning speed, marking a critical turning point in the defense of the British Isles against the V-1 flying bomb. The deployment strategy was meticulous, designed to maximize the fuse's tactical effectiveness while minimizing the remaining risk of enemy recovery. The anti-aircraft gun batteries defending London were rapidly supplied with the new shells. Gunners were initially skeptical of the magic shells, but their doubts evaporated with the first rounds fired. The effectiveness of the VT fuse against the V-1s was immediate and dramatic. The V-1, being an autonomous, fixed-altitude target, offered the perfect scenario for the Proximity Fuze. The invisible cone of shrapnel generated by the proximity detonation could easily rupture the V-1's wings or damage its pulse jet engine, ensuring its destruction. The statistical improvement was staggering. Before the widespread deployment of the fuse, conventional anti-aircraft guns achieved a kill rate of around 28% against the V-1s. Following the full integration of the VT fuse, this kill rate soared to nearly 70%. The air defense system was suddenly transformed from a costly liability into an impenetrable, lethal shield. This success was not lost on the British public or the German command. The sudden, marked increase in V1 destruction puzzled German intelligence, which noted the unprecedented density and accuracy of the Allied anti-aircraft fire. They suspected the deployment of a new technology, but remained uncertain of its nature. The security mandate remained fiercely enforced throughout the V1 campaign. All gun batteries utilizing the VT fuse were moved to coastal areas and deployment zones, where the destroyed V1s would primarily fall into the sea or into sparsely populated areas, ensuring that the critical internal mechanisms would be destroyed or unrecoverable. This meticulous management of the battlefield successfully shielded the secret from German espionage. The V1 campaign, designed to break the will of the British people and disrupt the D-Day logistics, was ultimately defeated not by fighter aircraft alone, but by the relentless, electronically enhanced accuracy of the anti-aircraft gunners utilizing the Proximity Fuze. The VT fuse proved its strategic worth on the home front, fulfilling the conditions of Roosevelt's original mandate and setting the stage for its final, decisive role in the European land campaign. The V1 crisis served as the perfect operational test, proving that the technical brilliance of the fuse could withstand the sustained pressure of high-stakes urban defense. Following its decisive success against the V1 threat, the VT fuse was finally cleared for widespread land deployment in the European theater, but only after specific calculated risks were weighed. The ultimate decision to fully unleash the weapon came during the darkest days of the Western Front. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The surprise German counteroffensive shattered Allied lines, creating a massive salient in the Ardennes forest. The fighting was characterized by brutal close-quarters combat, heavy snow, and persistent low clouds. The key tactical element required was highly effective, reliable defensive artillery fire to break up massed German infantry and armor formations. Standard artillery shells, relying on impact fuses, were largely ineffective in the deep snow and dense forest terrain. Tree bursts were nearly impossible to achieve reliably, and the shells often buried themselves deep in the snow before detonation, rendering their shrapnel harmlessly underground. The tactical situation had reached a critical mass. The need for a reliable proximity detonation over the battlefield to achieve devastating air bursts finally outweighed the risk of compromise. The VT fuse, previously designed for anti-aircraft use, was now adapted for ground artillery. The effect of the fuse was immediate and devastating. Artillery shells equipped with the VT fuse exploded just above the treetops or above the heads of advancing German infantry, creating a massive, lethal rain of shrapnel that was exponentially more effective than traditional impact fuses. The air bursts eliminated the protection offered by foxholes and the deep snow cover, shocking and decimating the German formations. German soldiers, who had never encountered such effective artillery fire, reported the use of a new miracle weapon. The psychological impact on the German command was equally profound. The unexpected shift in the accuracy and lethality of the Allied artillery fire introduced a crippling uncertainty into their advance. The Battle of the Bulge became the stage for the VT fuse's most significant tactical contribution to ground warfare, effectively transforming the capability of the Allied artillery divisions. The deployment was tightly managed, limited initially to the critical defensive sectors, but the success was so undeniable that the deployment was rapidly expanded. This decisive use of the fuse in the Battle of the Bulge is often cited by military historians as one of the most significant technological factors that turned the tide against the last major German offensive, securing the Allied victory in the West. The deployment of the VT fuse in the Battle of the Bulge showcased a crucial secondary engineering challenge. Adapting the complex electronics, originally designed for anti-aircraft use, to the brutal environment of ground artillery. Anti-aircraft shells are fired at high angles into the relatively stable air, but ground artillery shells travel in a low, arcing trajectory, often impacting frozen earth and dense obstacles. The electronic components had to withstand the extreme shock of low-angle impact and the persistent vibration of ground travel. Furthermore, the electronic signature of the fuse had to be tuned to avoid detonating prematurely on objects like heavy rain, smoke, or tall trees. The scientists and engineers supporting the ground deployment worked frantically to make rapid field adjustments. They adjusted the sensitivity settings to ensure reliable air bursts at the optimal height, usually 50 to 70 feet, above the ground, maximizing the lethality of the shrapnel. This required meticulous calibration across different types of terrain and under varying weather conditions. The performance of the VT fuse in the Ardennes was so exceptional that it became the immediate priority for all Allied ground artillery units. It effectively neutralized the German advantages derived from the harsh winter conditions. The effectiveness of the fuse in ground combat confirmed its ultimate status as a technological game-changer, proving its versatility beyond its initial naval role. The cost of manufacturing the fuse was considerable, yet its operational impact justified the expense many times over, saving both lives and material by dramatically reducing the number of shells required to neutralize a target. The success of the ground deployment during the decisive winter battle validated President Roosevelt's high-stakes gamble on the technology, proving that the initial risk of compromise was ultimately the correct strategic choice. The fuse went on to play a critical role in subsequent operations, providing overwhelming fire support during the Allied push across the Rhine and the final offensive into Germany. The story of the Proximity Fuze's transition from a secret naval protector to the most powerful ground artillery weapon stands as a testament to the transformative power of adaptable military technology. The final strategic impact of the VT fuse on the outcome of World War II is profound and multi-layered. Its initial role in defending the Navy against Japanese air attacks secured the vital sea lanes in the Pacific and preserved crucial American capital ships. Its decisive intervention in the V1 campaign preserved London as a logistical hub and maintained the morale of the British people during a time of immense terror. Its ground deployment in the Battle of the Bulge proved to be a critical technological factor in stabilizing the Western Front during the German counteroffensive. Allied commanders, including General George S. Patton, widely credited the sudden, overwhelming effectiveness of the artillery in the Ardennes to the deployment of the Proximity Fuze. The overall effect was one of technological dominance. The deployment of the fuse gave the Allies a persistent, measurable advantage in defensive and offensive engagements across all theaters of war. The extreme secrecy mandate, which governed its deployment for the first 2 years of the war, was ultimately successful. The Germans never managed to acquire an intact fuse, and thus they never successfully reverse-engineered the technology nor deployed effective countermeasures. The successful protection of the VT fuse stands as one of the most successful intelligence operations of the war, securing a strategic advantage that persisted until the final days of the conflict. The VT fuse's legacy extends far beyond World War II, fundamentally changing the nature of anti-aircraft and artillery warfare. The principle of proximity detonation became standard for virtually all subsequent high-explosive ordnance, paving the way for the development of modern missile guidance and detection systems. The miniaturization and ruggedization techniques developed to protect the fuse's sub-miniature vacuum tubes were foundational to the post-war electronics boom, contributing directly to the invention of the transistor and the subsequent miniaturization of electronics in general. The development of the VT fuse, therefore, was not merely a military success. It was a revolution in applied science and technology that provided dividends for decades after the war concluded. The historical narrative surrounding the Proximity Fuze remains unique, primarily due to the intense veil of secrecy that surrounded its development and deployment. This secrecy often led to fascinating and occasionally humorous operational oddities. For instance, The very existence of the VT fuse was kept classified even from many Allied commanders and troops who were utilizing it. Gunners were trained to operate the weapon under highly stylized conditions, often unaware of the intricate electronic mechanism that guaranteed their success. They simply knew the magic shell worked. This lack of knowledge served an important function, limiting the information that could be compromised if a crew were captured. The strict naval-only rule led to absurd situations, where a naval ship might utilize the fuse to defend against a Japanese bomber, while a nearby U.S. Army battery on a Pacific island would be strictly forbidden from using the same technology for fear of compromise. This political management of technology was a defining feature of the VT fuse program. The eventual decision by President Roosevelt to deploy the fuse over land against the V-1s was one of the most significant non-atomic strategic choices of the war, illustrating the immense trust placed in the assessment of the scientists and the critical need for a solution. The successful ground deployment in the Battle of the Bulge provided the final, undeniable proof of its strategic value, removing the need for continued restriction and leading to its full, widespread deployment across all fronts. The history of the proximity fuse is a testament to the powerful, often unforeseen consequences of concentrated scientific endeavor. The dedicated effort of the OSRD, bringing together physicists, chemists, and engineers, yielded a result far exceeding their initial expectations, providing an operational advantage that proved indispensable in securing the final Allied victory. The final after-action report on the proximity fuse confirms its status as one of the great technological achievements of World War II, a weapon of defensive revolution that fundamentally changed the calculus of modern warfare. Its initial development and deployment, characterized by immense secrecy and high-stakes operational choices, defined a period of technological warfare where a small electronic component held the key to strategic advantage. The fuse, born from the simple necessity of hitting a fast-moving aircraft, transcended its initial role to become a decisive factor in defending London and turning the tide of the ground war in the Ardennes. Its legacy is etched not only in the strategic map of World War II, but in the foundational science of the subsequent decades. The innovative techniques used to ruggedize the miniature vacuum tubes were a direct precursor to the development of the transistor, catalyzing the entire post-war electronics boom. The principles of the proximity fuse remain fundamental to modern ordnance, ensuring that the precision and lethality gained in the 1940s persist in contemporary missile and artillery systems. The story of the VT fuse offers a powerful lesson that concentrated scientific investment, when coupled with the strategic courage to deploy revolutionary technology under extreme pressure, can yield asymmetric advantages that fundamentally alter the course of history. It was a secret well kept, and a strategic gamble that paid off with a decisive, life-saving margin. The proximity fuse, therefore, stands as a symbol of the profound collaboration between science and military strategy, a permanent monument to the technological brilliance that ultimately secured the Allied victory.